I'll start that one. Now I've got that plane or helicopter coming over. So I'll just do that as well, and you can sync the audio and the video together.
Well, welcome to another episode of Bushcraft Survival, and it's my great pleasure today to be here with the founder of one of the most well-respected bushcraft schools in the world, Frontier Bushcraft, and today it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Kirtley. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Gordo. Thank you. Good to be here.
We're actually in Melbourne, in the Botanical Gardens of Melbourne. I'm not from Melbourne, I'm actually in my other capacity here working in Melbourne. We're caught up for the day. It's actually our second time we caught up, and we're just here for the day, and we thought we'd have a little chat about all things bushcraft, and it's just such a pleasure having Paul in the country. So what we might start off with, Paul, is just to let everyone know a bit about yourself and your background. We Frontier Bushcraft being one of the most premier schools in the UK, if not in the world, and just a little about your background, how you got into bushcraft, and yes, things like that would be wonderful.
Sure. Yeah, well, thanks, Gordo. So as Gordo's already very nicely introduced me, I have a bushcraft school called Frontier Bushcraft, which has been going since 2010. So we're in our 10th year now as we record this in early 2020. Prior to that, I was working full-time with Ray Mears. I did that for 5 years, and during that time I also worked with people like Juha Rankinen and Lars Falt. Before that, I was working part-time with Ray Mears from 2003, and before that I was a student of his on courses, so particularly again with Juha and Ray Mears. So this is kind of 20-year mark now for me, where I started doing courses at Woodlaw. Prior to that, I had an interest in survival, really, rather than bushcraft, and I started
as we all did, I guess.
Yeah, as we all did. You know, again, it's become a bit of a cliche, but I got Lofty Wiseman's Survival Handbook when I was 13 or 14 years old. My dad recognised that I was interested in these things and got me a copy of this SAS Survival Handbook in the 1980s when I was a teenage boy. And a few friends of mine that I grew up in a very sort of rural area, a few friends of mine that I grew up with, we all used to like to go to the woods and build dens and shelters and try and light fires and make little traps and things. And so it was just a sort of natural progression of that we were kind of interested to try and learn a bit more about those things. And so this kind of showed up like a little bit of a Bible, you know, full of all these great survival skills. And you know, we all tried to make the little survival tins, and you know,
was that common with lots of kids your
I don't know
age,
if it was common with lots of kids, but as I say, we grew up in a rural area, and there were a couple of other guys who were the same age as me. Lee and Gary were good friends of mine in this little village, and we all liked being outdoors. I mean, it's sort of pre-computer age. You know, I bought a ZX Spectrum, which is a 48K computer that we only ever used if it was raining so heavily that we couldn't be outside. You know, we played Space Invaders or something on it, and that was it.
And that was the only time you'd actually
That's the only
those.
time, yeah. And that was, you know, that was when I was about 11 I got that. So we weren't really of an age where we were sat inside playing computer games, and
so being wet was more of an inconvenience.
Exactly, yeah. It was kind of like, what do we do inside? You know, we're bored because we're inside. What can we do? Well, we played, you know, get to load up the games on a tape recorder, you know, and it was just like really slow, and you'd play on the TV, and as soon as it stopped raining, you'd be, you know, outside again, riding around on your bike or in the woods or what have you. So that was the kind of childhood that I had. You know, we're out in the country, we're playing in the woods, we're riding around on our bikes, we're running around the fields, we're playing hide and seek in the dark, you know, running around the village, and we were always just outside. And so, yeah, I don't know if that was super common. I think a lot more kids used to play outdoors back when, you know, I'm 46 now, so like sort of nearly 40, you know, sort of 30 to 40 years ago.
Like me.
Yeah, an old bugger like you. Like 30 to 40 years ago, I think a lot more kids did play outside, and, you know, parents maybe weren't so worried about traffic, they weren't so worried about their kids being abducted or whatever that seems to be like a real concern these days. And, you know, the only instructions we had was either come back in time for dinner or come back before it's dark, you know, and inevitably one of our mothers would be out, you know, dragging us by the ear. You know, it's dark, you know, you're supposed to be home by 8 o'clock, but we used to be running around the village. Or
my mother used to have a brass dinner bell, and it used to be rung, and you'd right, Deadman, the dinner at the Deadman's household. Yeah. So we had from the outskirts of the bush at Albach, and that's how we used to come back. So with Mum ringing the dinner bell. So I grew up in the countryside, running around the woods, playing out in the fields. A couple of my friends and I, we got some, you know, because it was the age of Rambo as well. So, you know, you could go down the into the local market town. There was a gun shop there, but they also had like pen knives, you know, Swiss Army knives and things. And then they started selling, you know, more like kind of survival knives and things. And so we all got a cheap survival knife and a pen knife, and we were doing stuff in the woods with those when we were kids. And that was kind of what we did until I guess we got caught up in exams a bit later on, you know, in our teens. Then went to university, and when I got to university, I went to university in Edinburgh, and that's the first time I'd ever lived in. And you studied mathematics?
Studied mathematics. I was good at maths. I didn't have to write any essays, which was great. So just do some sums.
They do now, though, don't they?
Probably. I'll probably have to colour stuff in now or something, the way education's gone. But anyway, that's a different conversation. But I went to Edinburgh University, and so that's the first time I'd lived in a town. But it also gave me access to the Scottish Highlands, so I could just jump on a train, student rail card, you know, cheap rail fare.
It's a beautiful place.
It is a beautiful place. Edinburgh is beautiful. It's a nice, if you're going to live in a city, there's a lot worse places to live in the world than Edinburgh. It's a beautiful city. Gets a bit busy in the summer with all the tourists and the Edinburgh Festival. I think the population of Edinburgh pretty much doubles in the summer. But, you know, through the winter, it was kind of quite a nice place to be as a student, and the university is sort of integrated into the town. It's not like you're out on a campus somewhere. So it was a nice place to be. But for me, one of the things was I could get to the countryside easily. So I was really into mountain biking then. So I had my mountain bike there. So I used to cycle out of Edinburgh, go out and cycle in the countryside, in the Pentland Hills and stuff. You know, just because I enjoyed it, but also to keep fit.
And why mathematics? What was your goal at the time?
I mean, the obvious thing is I was good at it at school. I found it enjoyable. I liked problem solving. I think in retrospect, although I don't necessarily think I recognised it at the time, the common theme with the other things that I'm interested in is that the areas of maths that I was really drawn to were more the practical areas, so sort of understanding how things worked, so what in maths would be called mechanics, as opposed to, I was never a great fan of statistics, for example. That was too dry an area of mathematics for me. I was more interested in the stuff that was maybe more linked to physics, you know, so that you so that, you know, that help model how the world works and help model how things and understand how things work. And I've always been interested in nature, and I've always been interested in how things work, and I always used to take things apart as a kid. You know, if I got a Star Wars toy or something, I'd play with it for a while, but then I'd take it apart and see how it worked. And I was always interested in that sort of thing. The mountain biking, I used to do all the servicing on my own bike. I used to take it all apart, you know, literally even the free wheel. I used to take it all apart and service it and put it all back together again. And so I was always kind of practical in that sense, and I think maths was in some ways an extension of that. As I say, I liked the problem solving part of it. It helps you think clearly as well. I think, you know, again, if I
logically as well,
think logically, objectively, rationally, which is useful in outdoor life as well. You know, you don't let your emotions get the better of you, and you can make decisions clearly, and you can weigh things up in a balanced way. So that's all useful, you know, risk management, risk assessment, it's all linked, you know, with that thought process, I think. So, but that wasn't my motivation for doing it. It was just, I was encouraged by my parents to go to university. It was something that my mum hadn't had the opportunity to do. She went to university later on in life, but she hadn't had the opportunity to go to university as a teenager. She left school at 16 and went straight to work. My dad did some college, but then started to work, and later on he did an Open University degree. So they were both keen for me to get a university education, and they supported me. And then they were like, well, you can do what you like after that, but go and get a university. And I liked maths and I was good at it, so I did maths. But as I say, there were other benefits as well. I got very cheap gym access. I could go cycle around Edinburgh. I could jump on the train and go to the Highlands and do backpacking trips. So Edinburgh worked really well for me as a university. So that was my university education. Then I ended up working in an office because I was a numerate graduate. So I ended up working at a financial company, which was well paid, but it wasn't what I wanted to do forever. And I continued with developing my outdoor skills. I kind of went down the sort of mountain leader route to start off with, and because I was into my backpacking and hill walking and that sort of stuff. But then eventually, as I was doing more and more kind of remote hiking trips, I kind of came full circle back round to being interested in survival skills, because I was starting to think about, well, what happens if this goes wrong, or what happens if my stove doesn't work, or what happens.
I'd be saying it's like being stuck in a bubble and being dependent upon
you
that
are.
bubble.
You're like almost in a, if you think about, if you're completely dependent upon your tent and your stove and all the equipment that you've got in your backpack, there's nothing wrong with that, but you are a little bit like being on a moon landing, that you're entirely dependent upon the stuff that you've got with you if you've got no ability to use the resources that are there around you. And so I kind of then was thinking back to the Lofty Wiseman Survival Handbook and some of the things we were interested in, probably like 10 years earlier than that, so I was sort of in my early 20s at this point, early to mid 20s, and I was doing these backpacking trips, and I was thinking, actually, I want to learn a bit more about how to light a fire in the rain and how to do all these different things in case I need to. And then the other strand to that really was, and I've told this story a number of times before, but it was a sort of key moment. I was doing a backpacking trip in the Pyrenees mountains that sit between Spain and France, and I was with one friend from university, and we'd done some hiking trips in Scotland before, and we were camping in this lovely kind of alpine meadow. So we weren't right at the top of the hill of the mountains, but we weren't right down in the valley either. We were kind of in this sort of sub valley, if you like, and it was sort of this lovely meadow, grass, flowers, and on the edge of this was an old barn. It was like it wasn't ever a farm, it was just an outbuilding, and it was all derelict, and the slate roof had sort of slid off the back and formed a kind of natural rockery, and in amongst all of this slate were growing these wild strawberries. And then we were camped out on this meadow, and I had a little bit of a wander around in the evening, poke around this old building, and I got round the back and I found all these wild strawberries. So I got my mug and I collected all these wild strawberries, and I literally got probably about 3/4 of a pint of these tiny little wild strawberries, and they're so full of flavour. They're much more flavour packed than cultivated strawberries, and I knew what they were because they used to grow in our garden in North Wales. So when I was a kid, until I was 10, we lived in North Wales, and they used to grow in the garden there. So my parents had taught me what these plants were and that you could eat them, and so I found them in Spain, and I collected them, and I went to my friend Mike. Hey, I was really excited. I found these wild strawberries, and he didn't trust me. He was like, "Are you sure they don't look like strawberries? They look too small to be strawberries. Are you sure they're edible?" And I'm like, "Yeah." But he didn't want to eat them, and I didn't try to persuade him too hard because I knew how good they were. So I ate all these wild strawberries myself, which was great. But then it also made me think, what else is there that I can eat that I might find on hikes and trips, but I don't know about, because I only know what I've been shown by my parents, and there's a few bits and pieces. They were keen gardeners, and my dad's knowledge of plants is pretty good, particularly cultivated plants and things that you might find around the garden. And so I was then kind of quite motivated to learn more about wild foods as well. So that was another strand. So it wasn't just about emergency survival skills, it was also what skills can I learn, what knowledge can I gain that's going to augment the trips that I'm doing. And so that kind of, all of those motivations together kind of led me down the path to where I ended up on bushcraft courses, basically, and that's then how I ended up kind of being drawn more into the bushcraft world.
And what stage did you say join Woodlaw, and as far as the transition from realising that you wanted to take that up seriously?
Yeah, so in the 1990s, that was all going on with hiking trips. And when I was born in 73, so I was 20 in 93, I graduated in 95. So yeah, it was in the sort of second half of the 1990s I was sort of motivated to start learning more about survival skills, more about wild foods and plant identification. And I was aware of Ray Mears at that point. Back as a kid, I used to get this catalogue from a company called Survival Aids, which doesn't exist anymore, but it had all this survival kit in it, survival knives and wire saws and button compasses and all this kind of stuff that was kind of, you know, what people wanted back then. And there was a knife in there that he designed. It was pre the Woodlaw knife, and so I knew his name from there. And then he appeared on TV with I never actually saw any of the tracks programs at the time, but there was
the country tracks.
The country tracks, but there was one called World of Survival, and World of Survival was really interesting because it was kind of quite anthropological. He'd go and spend some time with a native group, for example, and that was interesting. They were sort of typically half-hour TV shows, and so I knew his stuff of him and that stuff from those shows. Later on I saw the country tracks, even though they kind of came before, but they were only 5-minute slots on a magazine show that was on the BBC. So I knew of him, and then one day I found Woodlaw. They had a very small website. This was probably about 1997, 1998. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I'll make a note of that. And it wasn't like, here's all the courses on the website. It was like, you write off to this PO box.
Right.
Because this is like early website days, really. Not many people had websites, and so I guess it was more like people treat it more like putting an advert in a newspaper. You just kind of put a static thing up and write into this PO box, and we'll send you a brochure, which is what they did. So I got this brochure through the mail some point, probably about 1998, with these course descriptions, and I already had a number of trips planned for that year. So I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to do anything this year, but maybe I'll do one next year, maybe I'll do one in 99. In the end, I think I ended up not doing the course until 2000, but I did a fundamental course in 2000, and then I did a number of other courses in 2001, 2002, 2003. And
all 6-day courses.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. So I did, you know, the fundamental, the journeyman. I did the first ever axe course that Ray and Yuha ran. That was in 2002. Did that with my dad, actually. We did that together. Tracking course. They used to do a short outdoor cookery course, which I did. So I did about 6 courses, and then I also did an Arctic course with Mears and Lars Folt. And that was in early 2003, and I was a bit cheeky in retrospect, because I asked, oh, can I, you know, they said, oh, do these things on the course, and then I said, can I do these things extra, because I've seen you do it on TV, can I do a lean-to? And Ray was like, okay, yeah, as long as you do a good job of it, is what he said. And so we built a few of us built this lean-to as well, which he actually then photographed, and it ended up in one of his books. So I think we must have done a good job of it. It's in his book of photographs. But that was in 2003.
And Lars Folt, he's a father of Swedish Army military survival.
Yeah, for people that don't know Lars Folt, he started off the Swedish military survival school. He was parachute ranger school, and then he kind of developed the survival training side of the Swedish military. Yeah.
And Paul actually does a good talk with Lars Folt in one of your Ask Paul Kirtley podcast.
In one of the,
can't remember the actual number, but we'll put a note in.
Yeah, it was when I was at the Swedish Bushcraft Festival, and I did a section with Lars on that. And then there's also another one that I recorded at the Global Bushcraft Symposium, where Lars and Tom Luchins and Mors Kahansky are all talking together as well, and that'd be worth people listening to as well if they've not heard that.
Johan Schulman was there, I think.
Yeah,
as well.
Schulman was there as well. Yes, indeed, because he was a student on the 1995 symposium that Lars organised in Sweden, that Tom and Mors and Lars all instructed on. So yeah, that was that 1995 kind of get together discussion at the Global Bushcraft Symposium last year. So that was quite a nice little bit of history as well. So yeah, I was very fortunate to both learn from Lars. I did that course twice, actually. I did it in 2003, and then I did it in 2004 again, because I thought the course was so good. But by that stage, I'd been offered a role working with Ray Mears, because after the 2003 course, on the way home from that, we happened to be on the same flights, and when we were waiting for our connection at Stockholm, he came over and said, I've been thinking, do you fancy coming to help on some of the courses in the UK? So that's how that started. So I knew him from doing a number of courses with him, and then he offered me a role assisting on courses. So I started doing that in the summer of 2003. It was only a part-time job initially, just sort of holidays and weekends. And then after a couple of years of doing that, a couple of seasons of doing some assisting on courses, he then offered me a full-time job, which I took. So that then took me into full-time employment. So I took something that was an interest to a more serious study to a part-time job to a full-time job over the course of 10
and
years.
you end up being head of operations for
Yeah.
well.
So I ended up being the course director at Woodlaw. So I was responsible for the running and development of all the courses and the trips, managing the team, recruiting the team, training the team, putting in place training schemes, working in conjunction with Ray, but it was largely down to me to build the structure. And yeah, I did that over a course of about 5 years, working full time there. And then I'd done pretty much everything that they'd asked me to do. Literally, I had a list of things that they wanted me to develop when I first joined. I did all of that, and there wasn't really, not to get too finer, into the sort of weeds with it all, but there wasn't really a lot else new to do. And I was still quite ambitious, and I wanted to do new things which weren't really going to work within the context of Woodlaw, and that's fine, because that's Woodlaw. And so I then stepped outside of Woodlaw to continue doing the things, developing the things that I wanted to do, including doing a lot more things online. I could see that, looking ahead, that people learning online was going to be something that was much more important, and that was something that Woodlaw weren't particularly interested in. They weren't even really interested in using social media at that point, and I could see the potential there for connecting with people over a much wider field. And we'd never know each other, for example, if it wasn't for the internet, if it wasn't for online stuff. And
you share an awful lot of stuff for free, and it's an amazing amount of content you have, an incredible amount. And it's, I don't know how you get time to do it, but it's fantastic.
I've got a clone.
Right? You must have. And for those that don't know, Paul has his Ask Paul Kirtley series, which is actually no longer a series of 80.
It's at least paused, let's put it that way.
It's incorporated into the Paul Kirtley podcast.
Well, so there's the Paul Kirtley podcast, which is largely interviews. It isn't always interviews, long form interviews. Gordo might be on one at some point, we'll see. But that's all people like Lars Falt, it's people like Ray Goodwin and Justine Kergenven and Kevin Callan and James Raffin. I've had tons of John Hudson, Chief Survival Instructor of the British Military. Lots of people on there.
Lisa Fenton.
I mean, there's a list. There's 50 of them out there. Then I also had a Q&A show, which was Ask Paul Kirtley. That was both on YouTube and put out as a podcast. It wasn't getting a lot of traction on YouTube, which is one of the reasons I stopped running it. And then I tried to put the Q&A into my podcasts, but I'm not getting a lot of questions, so I'm starting to think about maybe resurrecting Ask Paul Kirtley, maybe at least as a separate podcast, but we'll see. That's just work in progress. So I've got my blog at paulkirtley.co.uk. That's got all my podcasts on it. It's got all the Ask Paul Kirtleys on it. It's got all the articles I've ever written for my blog on there, all in one place. So yeah, there is a ton of information there, and you can find other things like my YouTube channel and Instagram and stuff from there. So there's lots of.
And that's how I actually found by the Paul. I was actually driving to Sydney, listening to some audio books and podcasts, and I came across your interview with Tristan Gooley, and just the depth of information in that interview was, wow, this is good. And I started listening to a few, I think it was about 5 or 6, and I went, wow, this is some of the most in-depth knowledge on bushcraft I'd ever heard, and just so accurate. And that just, that's how we come to meet today after doing a couple of courses, which so 2 of the best courses I've done out of many courses, and fantastic. And so that's funny. And that was so anyone that hasn't heard those podcasts, they are fantastic, and there's so much information on them. I think six questions on average, 5 or 6. Sometimes there was more per episode, and there's like an hour of just talking our nerdy, not nerdy bushcraft stuff, but
Nothing
for
wrong
those,
with
yeah,
nerdy.
it's nerdy. And it's fantastic, absolutely fantastic, and just the people you interview are great as well.
Thank you.
So it's so after Ray or Woodlaw, and you've stepped out on your, and when did you start Frontier?
Frontier was started in 2010. So we've just come into our 10th year now. Frontier will be 10 years old come December 2020. And yeah, so we started off and hit the ground running really. After I left Woodlaw, a couple of people, I didn't poach them, they decided to jump ship as well, and they started working with me. Some of whom are no longer with me, unfortunately. Like Ian Lawson, for example, he was kind of quite, helpful at the beginning. Key part.
He was on the Woodcraft that I did.
That's a different Ian.
Okay, different.
Yeah. So that's Ian Gare. So Ian Lawson was somebody who was a tree surgeon, arborist, but he's emigrated to New Zealand since then. So he was working with me in the early stages of Frontier, but he's now living in New Zealand. So there were a few people who had worked with me at Woodlaw, and James Bath joined me, and we had quite a strong team quite quickly, and started developing, putting on some solid core bushcraft courses, and then developing some new things as well that I'd wanted to develop. We've developed a really strong offering in canoe training as well, but not just the paddle skills, also all of the campcraft skills and navigation, everything that goes with that, so people can make real wilderness journeys with their canoeing skills. And that's something for me has always been quite important. Going back to me doing the hiking trips when I was in my 20s in particular, that brought me really back around to survival and bushcraft. For me, I've always seen a lot of these skills in the context of making journeys and taking yourself into wild places, whether that's hiking, canoeing, driving a vehicle, whatever it is. It's like, what can I use when I get myself into remote places, either to augment the journey that I'm making or to help me out of a difficult situation should something kind of go not to plan. And so I've always been keen to help people develop the skills to make journeys as well, whether that's teaching navigation, whether it's teaching good hiking skills, whether it's teaching canoeing skills, so that people can make those journeys and take themselves to the places where those skills really have the most context,
practical
as well.
application.
Yeah.
It's as well as the tracking, and there's
Yeah.
such a large number of courses you offer, not just static courses, but those expedition type courses, which is something down the road I'd like to do. But once it's getting to those skills learnt first before we can undertake something like that. But then I suppose it's a matter of putting those skills into a course so they can be done.
Yeah, I think there's
together.
a sort of an iterative process there as well, that you learn some core skills, you practice them, maybe you go out and use them in a little bit further afield than you would have been confident to go before. You get that confidence, you come back, you learn some more skills, you consolidate, you go further, you do more remote trips. And I think even if you're doing that on your own, you get the basic training to start off with, and you go and do a trip, you come back and think about what worked, what didn't work, what could I do better, what kit worked, what kit didn't work, what did I do right with my firelighting, my cooking, my the food that I prepared and packed, and all of these things. It's not all bushcraft necessarily, but you have this kind of reflection on, okay, I've gone out and done a bit more than I've done before, what worked, what didn't. You come back, you think about it, you consolidate, and you go out and do a bit more. And of course you can throw extra courses and learning into that process as well to take your skills up to the next level as and when you need to. So yeah, absolutely. I don't think you ever go from, okay, I've learnt these few things, to doing this big thing here. I mean, some people do, but most people don't.
Because learning something statically is different, because than doing it on the, I suppose it'd be like any sort of sport, doing a series of exercises to give you the ball skills or something, and then putting that into a game.
Absolutely.
It's that transition between the two.
Well, I mean, you've done our elementary course, and even within that, we'll introduce we'll talk about knife safety to start off with, outside of the context of any applications of using knives, and then we will go and collect some materials to make some basic campcraft things that we need, and then we're starting to use the knives to fashion those things, but that's layered on top of having that basic knife safety understanding, and rules laid out to start off with, and then you'll use some of those things. You might have made some tent pegs. Okay, well, let's go and learn how to set a tarp up, and here's some knots and extra things to learn. Okay, we've made this pot hanger, let's put that into practice. Okay, well, you're going to have some fire lighting, so we'll teach you some fire lighting. You can put that into practice, and then you can cook a simple meal over the fire. Then the next day we might give you something more complex to cook, but you can and maybe a different way of lighting the fire, of at least getting the initial flame, but then you're applying and consolidating that same method of establishing the fire. And then later in the week we might be asking you to do a challenge task where you have to light the fire in a more difficult way or a more challenging way, and you have to boil some water so that you can make it safe to drink. And so all of these skills are being introduced individually, but then over the course of the week they're being combined in different ways. They're being stacked on top of each other in greater depth, and you're also being asked to maybe combine them in more complex ways than you are. And that does two things. One is it gives you varied practice, so you're not just practicing the same thing in the same way every single time. And the other thing is it gives you that consolidation of coming back to really fundamental things, not just covering them once in the course, but without making it boring and repetitive, we're bringing you back to the same important skills multiple times. So yeah, so that's in the course of that's in the course of a week on a training course. And obviously,
and on that last day there's an assessment, a written assessment, and which is great.
It's a challenge. It's a challenge. Yeah, it's more of a challenge, and you just putting a line where you're at that point, rather than being an assessment.
Sorry, wrong choice of words.
No, but it's
it's an individual. I remember you saying it's an individual reflection to give you an idea of where you're at.
Yeah, and it's not for my benefit; it's for your benefit. So you can go away and go, okay, I learned those plants pretty well this week. I got 19 out of 20 on the plant ID test, but this section of the written test, I didn't remember all these ways of lighting fires, for example. So maybe I need to go away and look at that in more detail. And so it gives you a marker, if you like, of where you're at with what you've remembered from the week, and then you can go back and fill those gaps in. So again, it's part of that consolidation and iteration and going back through those processes.
And it's a very, very thorough, comprehensive course, Alan. Very, very, very comprehensive. As is your Paul also has some brilliant online course. He has his plant ID course, which is tailored more for the northern environment, but he also has a brilliant elementary bushcraft course, and that's fantastic as well. And that's a reflection of a lot of the courses taught on the actual physical course for obviously people that can't attend or too far away. However, that's no I don't think it's an obstacle. It's a matter of getting a plane ticket and going there, and it is worthwhile. Really, it really is worthwhile, and it's a fantastic course as well. And it's a different layer of learning, and you can just rehash it as many times as you like.
I mean, it's a revision process. So there's that core material that we cover on the elementary field course, and of course you get the benefit of having hands-on experience of doing it all there and then in a relatively short space of time, with myself and the guys who work with me being able to coach you. We typically have at least 3 instructors and assistants, sometimes 4, and we have 12 students maximum. So we can give you a lot of coaching and help on that course and get you up the curve quickly. But of course you have to physically be there. And one of the other disadvantages, as well as having to travel, which might be difficult for some people, is also I can't teach you how to build a snow shelter in the UK in June. I can teach you shelter principles, and we can look at some leaf shelters and some other things, but one of the advantages of an online course is that we can jump from the UK in June to Sweden in February to Canada in another time of the year, and we can look at lots of different options. So the online elementary's actually got more material in it than the physical elementary, because we can do things that we can't do. We can't jump from one season to the next on a physical course in the space of a week. So I think the two sit together very, very well. You've got this revision of the core material that you've covered on the physical course, and then you've also got all the other material that's added in there as well. So that works well even if you do the physical course. If you don't do the physical course, all the material's there, but you're just going to have to go and motivate yourself to practice a lot of it on your own, which a lot of people do. I mean, I've had a great success with, there's a kind of a core group of guys in Canada who didn't originally know each other but have chosen to do the online elementary, and because they've got access to woods there, you know, they've got massive amounts of outdoor space that they can easily get access to, they can go and practice a lot of these skills and make them work in their own environment, and that's worked really well. Like every single student who's come onto the online elementary who's in Canada has got an awful lot from it because they've got the resources there. So even though they're physically very separate, you know, it's a long way to come to do a week-long course, and it's expensive. It's more expensive to do the physical course, and it's more expensive, you know, you've got to fly. They can, at a fraction of the cost of the physical course, get the online materials and go and practice in their own time with all of these great resources that they've got in their backyard, and that works really well as well. So yeah, again, it's that sort of tapestry of different learning opportunities. There's free stuff online, there's paid stuff online, and then there's the physical courses in the field, and people can mix and match like you do.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and that's always been the strategy.
Down the line, I suppose you'd be going to intermediate and have that type of thing, and imagine that
yeah, maybe. I mean, there are some other online things in the works. I've got a book in the works, and I'm going to do some online resources that go alongside the book as well. That I don't think the
and you've just finished writing your book.
I've finished writing the book. It needs a little bit of revision and condensing, and there's too many words at the moment. It needs squishing down a little bit. Without
How long has that taken you?
I mean, the whole process from when I was first,
No matter where you go, you've actually,
just because that's quite loud. The whole process from when I was first asked to do it to now has been about 2 years, but I haven't spent 2 years writing it. You know, in some ways I could say it's taken me 15 years to write it, because a lot of the material that's in the book, the photographic material, has been taken over years and years and years of teaching and tripping, and so I've got the benefit of taking all of these different photographs and including them in the book. If I'd set out to try and get those photographs to write the book, it wouldn't be as good a book as it's going to be, because I had this library of photos that I
have a
could
name
draw.
for the book, or not yet? You can't disclose it?
As far as I know, it is going to be called Wilderness Axe Skills and Campcraft. Yeah, that is going to be the name of it. Yeah, it's what it says on the tin.
I don't envy you, and I can only imagine how the task of writing a book and how much work goes into it, and the time taken to actually do it. Like, it's
you know
incredible.
what? I think the best analogy is actually a survival situation, because if you just think about the entirety of the situation, you get overwhelmed by it. And it's the same with, if you think about the entirety of writing a book, you get overwhelmed. Like, I've got to write 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 words or whatever, and you think, flipping heck, I'm never going to be able to do that. Whereas if you chunk it down, as you say, if you break it down into manageable steps, okay, what's the structure going to look like? How many chapters? What do we need to cover? What are the headings? Okay, well, we've got some structure. Okay, now let's sort of compartmentalize it. Okay, now we've got this chapter. What do we need to include in that chapter? Let's put some bullet points in, and you do that, and then you've got that structure, and then you start writing. And initially what I do is I just write as if I was just sort of explaining, and actually some of it I actually just dictate. I just kind of go blah, sort of brain, vomit onto, and then tidy it up afterwards.
All right.
I think if you try and write like you want the finished product, it just becomes too, you just get too wrapped up in your own self-censoring. I think you just have to get it on paper. I think it was Hemingway that said you should write drunk and edit sober.
Right.
And not that I necessarily followed that, although I think I probably did write some after a few glasses of red wine some evenings, but there's that sort of flow. You just you don't care what it is, you just get it out, and then you tidy it up afterwards. And
otherwise you lose that.
Otherwise you lose the spontaneity and the creativity, and just, you can't write as fast as you can think. And so I think that's why speaking it sometimes helps. But I think what you can do is you can do the sketch, you can bullet point out quite quickly, and that's like the speed you think. So like literally do like a brainstorming, get it down on paper for every chapter, and then once you've got those chapter sort of structures, make sure you're happy with that, and then you can just fill in the gaps and then just write stuff. and it might be a bit spurious. You'll need to edit it down, but then you edit it down afterwards. And if you just write each one like a little magazine article, a little blog article, and you give yourself enough time to do it, all of a sudden you've got 20, 30, 40, 50,000 words written. It's like, okay, it's done.
Wow.
And then you tidy it up, and yeah.
I think Gatwick Airport's followed us.
Yeah,
over
it's
here,
followed
no?
us.
And believe it or not, it's actually summer where we're like this.
Yeah, it's like
And it's
17 degrees and raining in Melbourne today.
Yeah.
So.
Hopefully raining everywhere else at the time we are
Yeah.
in New South Wales.
So the bushfires, yeah, absolutely.
Well, that sort of lead with the talking about your courses. It leads me into asking. It's an important thing, but I'm sure that most of our viewers here are interested in knowing. Certainly myself, is your thoughts on. We know there's differences between survival and bushcraft, and your thoughts on the relevance of why people should do bushcraft in today's modern world. And that's probably going to be different in different countries. And what your, I know that's a big question.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of big reasons why I think bushcraft's relevant. One is it gives people connection with the natural environment, and that might sound a bit hippie-ish, but we are part of the natural environment originally. And one of the things I hear a lot from people who come on courses is that they spend all day, every day, sat in a cubicle, sat in an office, and they just crave some connection with green spaces and just getting out into the woods, fresh air. And that's before you get any understanding. It's just like, I just want to spend a bit more time outdoors. And so it's a vehicle through which you can interact with nature. You can be in nature and interact with nature. So it's valuable even just from a well-being perspective. And then of course you've got the practical benefits of, which was more the reason I was interested in bushcraft in the first place. What can I eat? What can I light a fire with? Because I want to be able to do those things. I want to be able to, regardless of the weather, if the materials are there, I want to be able to light a fire and use it to get warm, to dry my clothes, to boil my water, to make my food palatable, safe to eat, or whatever it is, signal fire, all of those reasons you might want to be able to light a fire. I want to be able to do those things because that could be just something I want to do day to day on a trip. I like spending time outdoors. I like doing trips outdoors. I want to be able to light a fire at the end of the day after I've paddled all day on a canoe trip, regardless of whether it's raining or not, and cook my dinner and make my water safe. And that's nothing to do with survival situations. That's got to do with, I want to use it as part of what I do outdoors. It's practical in the same way as I want to be able to swim and I want to be able to tie my shoelaces, and all of those things are practical things that you want to know how to do because they make you more able to do the things that you want to do. And then you've got the, you sort of step into survival world. Well, okay, what if we're on a canoe trip together and we capsize and we swim to the side of the river, but our canoe's lost, it's either gone off down the river or it's wrapped on a rock or whatever, and we're there in the middle of the wilderness and we've just got what we've got on our clothing, we've got our buoyancy aids, what we've got in our pockets, we might have a Swedish fire steel, or we might just have a knife, or we have to make a fire. One of us might be cold, we're both wet, we're going to have to spend the night out before anybody comes looking for us. Then it starts to turn into more of a survival situation. Now, you and I'm sure would be quite comfortable. We'd probably even go, yeah, we'll do that for a laugh. We'll go and spend the night in the bush with a penknife and a fire flash.
Probably have one right
Yeah.
now, but we can't.
I'm sure the Melbourne Botanical Gardens wouldn't be so happy if we did that. But the point is that we're comfortable in that situation because we've got the skills. But for other people, it would be a more serious survival situation. And even for us, if we've been in cold water, we climb up on shore, the night's drawing in, it's raining, it's going to be cold overnight. One of us might be a bit hypothermic by the morning. We want a fire, we want to maybe put something down on the ground, we want to maybe put some sort of shelter up. And so for me, there's also a kind of, as you step out of your day-to-day using it as part of your outdoor life into using it to deal with difficult situations, you step more from bushcraft into survival skills then. So I don't think, and there's, the skills might be exactly the same. You might be lighting a fire every day to boil your water and cook your dinner, but then if you're stuck somewhere, you're lighting your fire to keep your friend warm.
Doing it under pressure.
Yeah, but you need it for different reasons, but the skills are the same. So I think some skills are very much survival skills, or some things are only things that you would do in a survival situation. Like there are some things that I wouldn't eat as part of my day-to-day foraging. Like before we recorded, we talked about bracken. So over the long term, bracken's probably not a great thing to be eating. But if I was really hungry and there was some bracken, I might, some fiddleheads, I might consider eating them just to get a bit of food in. Although there is issue with thiaminase and things, but there are some things.
An awful lot.
Yeah, but there are some things that I wouldn't eat normally that I might do in a survival situation. So in that sense, you want to make that distinction between, is it survival, is it not? For example, you might be in a park where the rules are no fires, so you might be using a stove, but then if you end up in a situation where you need to light a signal fire, notwithstanding the risk of lighting a bushfire, you don't want to be in the middle of a bushfire or start a bushfire, but if we were in a park in North America that's had no fires, and we've been using a stove to cook our food, if we were stranded and somebody was looking for us, I'd light a fire so that I could signal to them. I don't care what the park rules are. So that's, you step over from your
but you'd also have the ability to do it safely, so it wasn't a risk as well.
Yeah, but also, there are rules that you follow when you're following your normal day-to-day life, but as soon as you step over the line into a survival situation, the gloves are off. The most important thing is you get home safely. That's kind of what defines it as a survival situation. So for me, there are things that you wouldn't do normally. Stay within the rules, stay within the bounds of what's good for your health on a long-term basis, but once you step into something that's a survival situation, then you're going to do things that are going to expedite your safety and your comfort and getting home in the short term, regardless of what the long-term issues are going to be. So I think that is one thing that separates, but it could be exactly the same skills that you're using. It's just the context changes.
I find that a lot of people learning survival skills, the attitude is it's something they need to learn in case something goes wrong, but a lot of those skills end up being very rewarding and very interesting in their own right. And then people think, oh, hang on, this has opened up this door, I'm going to follow there, and then they get more into the I say not the art side of bushcraft, but there is an art to it. It's about a respect and that goes beyond what, so once the survival situation dictates, I would respect is probably the best word I could think of. But then to find, wow, these skills are actually fun, particularly seeing kids get these skills and think, oh wow, this leads to that, and then they have an interest in plants, and it goes a lot further than just something you need to do just in case something goes wrong.
Absolutely, and there's several things wrapped up in that. One is that it's just rewarding to do things that you get some success in. So you talk about kids, if you can teach them and guide them to learn how to build a shelter and make a fire and stuff, yes, those things are kind of fun in themselves, but also there's a kind of mental reward that they're achieving something. And it's the same with them learning to do a handstand or ride a bike or whatever. There's a nice reward process that goes on there as a result of the achievement. And so that's there as well. But then, as you say, there's more depth that they can go into if they find they're interested in those things, whether they're kids or adults. They can go further into wild foods, they can go further into botany, they can go further into fungi, natural navigation, whatever areas that they're particularly interested in. There's a whole rabbit hole that they can go down.
A myriad of different topics. We could probably, we chatted about this before, about with the current situation with Australian bushfires, and particularly just about, and it's talking about making fire, of course, in this, not you'd think so today, but in the climate that's what's happening, is the skills in learning how to make a fire and manage that fire properly and clean up after you so that there's no sign. Personally, I feel that a lot of these fires are a result of people not knowing that or not having the respect to do that, and there's probably 40 to 50% of those fires are due to that. I think it's a very low number actually naturally lit, and how these skills of bushcraft can actually aid in preventing a lot of these fires from occurring, just from knowing how to do things correctly and properly and at the right time.
I think without having specific knowledge of any and there's a lot of fires burning across New South Wales and into Victoria right now as we speak. without knowing the ins and outs of of all of those different situations. I think generally one thing that I notice, whether it's here in Australia, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in Canada or anywhere else I've ever been, is that people that have never had any training in fire lighting and fire management tend to have fires that are way too big. Just they just want to chuck loads of stuff on, and that in itself can get things out of hand. Then there's also choosing where you're going to put a fire. What type of ground do you put it on? I mean, there's plenty of places in the UK that if you lit a fire there, it would cause problems. Peaty ground, areas where there's lots of heather when it's dry. You will set off serious fires unless you either don't have a fire or put it in a safe place. Like so on peaty ground in Scotland, you want to be down on a riverbank somewhere where it's all pebbles and you can have a fire there. It's not going to set fire to the ground. There's plenty of water there for you to put it out. Any charred debris is going to get washed away the next time the river comes up. Then you're leaving no trace in that place. You're not having a fire, making a fire scar on peat, setting fire to heather, burning tree roots and all those sorts of things.
Believe it or not, Northern Australia, the same thing happens after floods in an area, after wet season. Swampy areas, if you don't dig down to the ground, even in cleared area, that will burn underground and resurface somewhere else, and you can see the fire. And that's in an area where you wouldn't expect it to happen.
That's interesting. So yeah, it's understanding the consequences of having a fire of any size in a particular environment. It's having the judgment then to choose whether or not to have a fire, because there are some situations where it's probably just too risky to have a fire. And you exercise that judgment, and then if you want to have a fire, you need to have a fire. It's knowing and having the judgment of where to have that fire and keeping it small enough. So again, one thing that I see a lot is that people burn way too much fuel initially. You'll say cook a basic meal on a fire on a basic course, and they'll be using way too much fuel, whereas you can do it more efficiently. And so, but that comes with experience. So again, the less stuff that you're burning, the less effort it is. The less effort it is to tidy up afterwards, because you're not making as big a fire scar, you're not leaving as much charred remains, but also the less risk there is of you setting fire to anything else, whether it's by sending stuff up. Another thing that people often don't make a distinction between is burning wood, which is actually quite clean, doesn't send a lot of, if you've got dry wood that is fit for burning, it doesn't send a lot of embers up, it doesn't send a lot of ash, burning debris up. But once you start throwing garbage on the fire, paper, cardboard, plastic, that gets carried up, still alight and lit on the thermal, and it drops down, and then you've got a problem. So it's understanding those nuances of using a fire and what's acceptable and what isn't in different circumstances, and that's all education. Nobody's born with that knowledge. Nobody comes out.
A lot of people think they do. Oh, it's light a fire, a cigarette, and it's that sort of mentality, not knowing what to put on when, and even just the attitude is all any sort of fire, particularly it's at all embers, but it only takes a certain size of fire produces embers. Burning a particular what you're putting on that is going to be transport somewhere else. But if a small fire with correct clearance, as a cooking fire, the size you need, and really unless you're trying to keep yourself warm in freezing conditions with a log-long fire, there's no need to have small fire. And with the right wood, there is no risk of embers going as well. And then, unless a lot of people also, I think, find personally, what I find is confuse the word tinder dry conditions. You've got tinder dry, but you've got lots of debris that isn't necessarily tinder at all. You take an ember and you wouldn't even get that to light. As you know, when learning friction fire lighting and all these other methods, actually lighting a fire can be pretty bloody hard sometimes, and it's not as easy. And so for some of these fires to be lit, someone's actually either through complete negligence and burning the wrong type of material and too big, so it's transported somewhere else, so it's actually flame, or they've set a light or a flame to that. And that's the other thing that I find as well, is that unless if you've got grassland, it's actually sometimes it's quite difficult in some of where
you've got to be going some in some places to get a fire going, as you say, at all. But Also to try to get it to spread. I mean, there's lots of times, like last summer, not the summer that's just gone in the UK, so June, July, August 2018 in the UK was incredibly dry, and we had no problems on our courses with people having fires for cooking on. People were saying to me, "Oh, are you still having fires?" Because everything was dry. We didn't have any rain for 6 or 7 weeks in the UK, which was, it's unusual, and everything was very dry. It had been quite a dry winter as well. There hadn't been a lot of snow over the winter anywhere. Hadn't been a lot of rain, so the ground started off quite dry, and then we didn't have a huge amount of rain in the spring, and then we got into the summer and we had no rain, and everything was super dry. You might remember you might have seen that video I did where I was digging into the ground looking for water. You seen that one?
Yes,
yeah, that was that summer, because there was virtually no surface water, and you had to then start employing some of the techniques. Very, very dry summer, one of the driest summers we've had for a long time, but we had no problems with fires, with people using fires, clearing the ground properly, leaving things safely afterwards. And you can do that as long as you've got the right training and you've got the discipline to keep things the right size.
Of course, cleaning up, so there's properly cleaning up, making sure the ground's cold to touch, wet to touch, and then scattering the ash. And when I was in Sweden last year now, it's just on the 5th of January. New decade, scary.
Yes.
And I was just amazed at the respect for the land and the law Alamans Vetten, and just the right to roam, and how you can camp anywhere. Private property is not, as long as it's not within 100 metres of a dwelling, you can camp, you can have a fire, and they get pretty wild fire in the summer months over there with all the pine and that, and they don't seem to have that problem. It's that therefore comes down to a lack of respect that they have for the land. Is it because people are taught those skills from an early
I think it largely goes down to education in my experience. I'm not speaking as a Swedish person, and Johan Skolman or Lars Falk might be a better person to ask, but in my experience of having spent some time in Sweden, it seems to be largely down to education, that people teach their kids the right ways and wrong ways of doing things, and maybe show them by example as well. So if they're going out and doing a camping trip or what have you, then they show their kids this is the right way to do stuff, and then it gets passed on. It's like any knowledge, and we're often talking about the loss of indigenous knowledge, aren't we? But a lot of that's lost simply because it isn't passed on from parents to kids, or from grandparents to grandkids, and it only takes 1 or 2 generations of it not being passed on, and then nobody knows how to do anything.
And with the equipment focus, with say modern camping, and I remember the episode you did with Lisa Fenton talking about the history and of bushcraft into survival, and camping, and what modern camping's become, and how people's preoccupation with equipment. Having the equipment, it sort of takes them away from being able to use some of these skills.
I think it can be a distraction for sure for people. I think it's understandable because we've got more equipment than ever to choose from, and so it's like, okay, well, let's take advantage of the best stuff, and we all do it. We all kind of pick and choose the things that we want to use, but if you don't have any knowledge, then everything's a shiny object, and you're like a magpie and you collect all the shiny objects, and that kind of becomes a distraction over what's underneath in terms of the deeper knowledge, and that's one thing. I think the other thing as well is that most people who are going to enjoy the outdoors are not professionals. They're not like you or I with the backgrounds that we've got, where we spend a lot of time outdoors as part of our professional life. They're people who, you're from Australia, I'm from the UK, and it's the same in Canada, it's the same in the USA. Most modern most modern economies, developed countries, in this global civilization that we live in, 80 to 90% of people live in urban or suburban environments, and most of those people many of those people are knowledge workers. Many of those people work in offices, they work indoors, they're not spending a lot of time indoors. And when they go outdoors, it's kind of a bit of medicine for them, and they relax, get away from the work, get away from the office environment, get away from the city. But they don't have a lot of experience, and that's not a judgment, that's just an objective fact. They don't have a lot of experience, they don't have a lot of opportunity to develop experience, and most of their time thinking about the outdoors is not when they're outdoors, it's when they're wishing they were outdoors. It's when they're in the office on a lunch hour, looking at my blog or watching one of your videos or what have you, or in the evening. So a lot of people sustain their interest through the time that they can't be outdoors by consuming online material, or they're browsing websites thinking about what the best piece of kit to buy. They're reading gear reviews, they're buying gear and sorting their gear, and I know a lot of people who do this. They kind of buy little bits and pieces of gear all the time, and they're sorting out their gear.
Would you say this is one of the reasons for the obsession of kit?
I think, yeah. So this is one. I think it's a way that people can keep in touch with their interest. And don't forget, we live in a fairly materialistic, world where people like to obtain things, and they can obtain these things and build up their kit. So if you're doing a hiking trip as your summer holiday, and that might be a 2-week trip that you're doing, or maybe even a week-long trip, you can spend all year researching the gear, researching your route and where you're going to go and what's the right boots to be wearing, and you might buy those boots and you might wear them for a few day hikes to wear them in. You're going to buy a tent, you're going to buy a rucksack, and you can spend most of your time, like the hobby becomes preparing for the trip rather than the actual trip. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but you can see how you then get into majorly focusing on the equipment and not the other aspects.
That's, I know you're always beating that drum, but it's, as far as comments you get, but it is valid, and it's of course the knowledge of how to use, having the best equipment for something is great. But I find in Australia, it's different with the camping culture. It's 4-wheel drive camping culture, but sometimes I know guiding, when I'm out guiding in Kakadu and things like that, the amount of paraphernalia people take is just incredible. Like pretty much everything that they've taken from home, they may as well just put their house on the back of the truck. And you think, what's the point? Why are you doing that? And I understand, but not everyone has the same level of experience, and it's inching into it comfort-wise. But
that's the flip side of it. So people want to be comfortable. People are concerned about doing without certain home comforts. People don't have any skills necessarily that they can replace those things with. So it's going back to that being in the bubble. Like, if you don't have any skills of using the natural materials around you, then everything that you want to do in the outdoors, you have to take something with you that facilitates that, otherwise you can't do it. And so for me, one of the things that's good about bushcraft, even if you don't use all the skills all the time, which frankly I don't, I'll do a canoe trip in Canada and I will be using certain skills every day, and other things I won't use at all. Even though I can do them, and I could do them with some of the materials that are there, it's not relevant to the trip that I'm doing. I don't need, if I'm doing a canoe trip where I have to cover distance, even though I could make a wonderful lean-to in the forest there, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it because it doesn't help my journey in any way, shape or form. But as a fallback skill, if I'm stranded and my tent's shredded, or I don't have my tent, then great, I can build a shelter. I know what to do, but I'm not necessarily going to do those things every single time I do a trip. But it's having this repertoire of different skills, so that if I need to do something, whether it's cook my dinner or build a shelter because I've lost my canoe, I've got that repertoire of skills that I can use. And so if you don't have any of those skills, then you either get into serious difficulties when things go wrong because you don't have the skills to fall back on, or on a day-to-day basis you need a piece of equipment that does every single different task that you need doing for you.
Dependent upon that equipment. No, that's really interesting. I find that was it Leopold, I remember that talk about, made that comment about modern camping, pads us against the bumps of nature, which is quite a nice, but or talking about like using friction fire. By making friction fire, it actually makes all your other fire lighting skills better. But sometimes I've had comments from people saying, what's the point in learning an antiquated way of making fire when you can do that. And you said, well, you know, it's like, well, sure, but that's no different than someone collecting antique cars or something. That's also an interest, but it's also it's a skill that aids another skill, and it's a window into the past.
It does, yeah, and I think that's an important point, that it improves other aspects. And then going back to your training analogy, you know, you're talking about ball skills, and there's certain things that footballers do in training that they don't do in the match. You know, there's certain things that boxers do to prepare for a boxing match that they don't do in the boxing match, but it's part of their training because it makes them better at the thing that they need to do. And so you can view it simply in that sense if you want, that even if, you know, if you're not using bow drill ever other than as a training thing, it makes your other firelighting that you do on a daily basis when it's game day, if you like, when you're out on a wilderness trip. You know, I'm quite happy to, you know, rock up at the end of a day to an unknown campsite and light a fire with a ferro rod or a box of matches or a lighter, and I'm confident that it will go, because my firelighting skill is much deeper than that. You know, whereas if all I ever do is light a fire with really easy materials on sunny days with a Bic lighter, when it's raining and wet in an unknown environment, I'll probably struggle to get a fire because I've got no depth to my skill set. So I think one of the things about learning a full repertoire of skills and learning them deeply is that you've just got you've got a big base to stand on, and you're very strong in doing that. And that's important too. And then the other thing, you know, modern equipment pads you against the bumps of nature, but what's a stronger padding against the bumps of nature is what's up there.
Knowledge weighs nothing.
Yeah, but your mental attitude. And so being confident is important, not being overconfident, not being cocky, but being confident in your abilities to look after yourself is important. And the more skills you have that are relevant to being able to do that, the more confident that you're going to be. Certain situations that would be terrifying for some people wouldn't be terrifying for you, because you've got the skills and the experience to kind of go, well, yeah, I know how to deal with this, I can deal with it. And that
becomes like inconvenient camping.
Exactly, inconvenient camping, exactly, yeah. And so it's important from that perspective as well, I think. If you want to have resilience in your outdoor skills, then learn more than you need to know. You know, learn more than you think you're going to need to apply on your regular camping trips, because if you've then got redundancy in your game, you know.
Now no, sorry, go on.
And that's an important thing, because it gives you more mental resilience. You're not fragile in like, well, if this doesn't work, I've got nowhere else to go. And also just having that confidence generally outdoors. And I mean, for me, and it's something I've said to other people recently, it's like, I'm very, very happy and comfortable in the woods in the UK, go to Scandinavia, go to Canada, because I've been there a lot and I know the species of trees and plants there. I've been to Australia more in the last few years, but I'm still learning the trees and plants here. Even some that might be familiar to many people here, not necessarily even those that are, you know, that deeply into bushcraft and survival. But the real thing, the really interesting thing is that how that makes me feel. Like if you plonk me in the woods in Canada, or plonk me in the woods in the UK or Sweden, or that kind of northern temperate and into the boreal, I feel very at home, because I'm surrounded by things that I recognise and that I know the uses of, and that I'm also skilled in the uses of. I come here, all of those resources may well be here, but because I don't know them as well, I don't feel as comfortable in the bush here as I do in the bush in other places, because I don't have that interface with the environment that I've got in other places, because I'm not as familiar with it. So that then puts you on the back foot immediately. So, and that's where a lot of people are anyway.
Psychology-wise, survival-wise, that's huge.
Yeah. So, but that's where a lot of people are anywhere they go. You know, they might enjoy green spaces and they might come to this botanical garden, or they might go to Central Park in New York, or they might go to, you know, a park in London, and they'll enjoy the green space and they'll enjoy the bird song and whatnot and being away from the traffic, but they won't necessarily recognize any of the trees and the plants, and they don't necessarily want to, But for me, I want to know what all of these things are used for, and I want to know whether or not it's poisonous to eat, or whether I can eat that, whether I can make cordage from it, or whether I can light fire with it. And until I do, I don't feel fully comfortable looking at it. No. You know, frankly, you know. So.
Now, do you think, I'm not sure what it's like in the UK as far as children learning this at school? We talked about the value of its education. I mean, a lot of these skills people can do courses, but do you find, I mean, we've got the scouting movement, which has changed a lot as well, and it's changed here, and it differs in probably what I've seen in the UK when I was teaching, school teaching over there. But do you find, do you think bushcraft should be, say, introduced, or elements of it, into the school curriculum?
I think it might be useful if that were the case. I mean, I think there's a number of things that you could teach to kids that aren't taught to kids. I'm increasingly of the opinion that a lot of education in schools is completely redundant. It's setting people up. I mean, most of the education system that we came up through was designed a long time before, and we talked about being before the computer age and before the information age. Kids can get a lot of information now that we used to have to memorize. You can get it on your phone super quickly. And I'm not necessarily saying that you shouldn't learn your times tables, because that you get a certain mental agility from having stuff in your head. But equally, there's certain things that you had to learn by rote at school, like dates of certain kings being born and died. There's no need to know that unless you're an actual historian. You know, you can look it up quickly. And even if you did learn that at school and spent a lot of time on it, unless you're practicing it and regurgitating it on a regular basis, and when we know that our memories fade over time, I think you lose about 7% memory of anything a year. Yeah, some faster than others. So, you know, if I haven't been to Australia for a couple of years, and I haven't revised my notes, my knowledge of the trees and the plants starts to fade off. And that's something I'm interested in. And so unless you're constantly learning and relearning things,
what you don't use, you lose.
What you don't use, you lose. Absolutely. So there's a lot of stuff that we spend an awful lot of time learning at school that's of no freaking use whatsoever, and we can look up easily, and so that's kind of annoying. It's setting people up to work in certain environments, not necessarily think for themselves. So that's like a big bugbear with education. I think there needs to be an overhaul there. But then, you know, why are we not teaching kids first aid?
Exactly.
You know, why are we not teaching kids basic survival skills? Why is every kid not taught to swim at school? Why are kids not taught how to cross the road? You know, basic financial management, basic outdoor skills, you know, life skills, how to relate to people, how to be kind to people, how to manage relationships, negotiation skills, all of these things that we need.
Needs,
how to look after yourself physically, how to plan your nutrition and your food, how to work to a budget, all of these things that we need to do as an adult, we're not teaching kids at school. And nor are parents particularly necessarily well set up to teach their kids those things in entirety themselves. So yeah, I think we're doing future adults and future society a great disservice by not teaching people a lot of these things. And yeah, so I don't think you'd necessarily want to go into massive depth in a lot of areas of bushcraft.
Key elements.
So you're talking about, you know, fire safety in the bush. Why not just teach kids that? Why not just...
Right, here we go. Well, the battery went out and we just had to change the battery. We're only going to have a talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, but it's nice though. It's good. So we were talking about just the key elements of bushcraft in school and what.
Yeah,
areas.
I think it would, you know, so some fire safety, some basic what to do if you get lost would be a good thing to teach people. If you look at you know, I have a few sort of Google feeds that I monitor. You know, you can kind of Google News if you like. You know, you kind of monitor different types with keywords and things like lost hikers, and you know, it's the same things that happen over and over again. You know, it's not some complex situation that nobody's ever thought of before. It's the same thing that happens over and over again in terms of people getting lost, people getting benighted, staying out, things taking longer and them having to stay out overnight, not knowing what to do if they get lost. All of those basic things you could teach people, and it doesn't take a long time to teach them either.
No, but with fight, we're actually getting them to do it, because there's lots of things that are paid lip service as well, and they're not, and so kids aren't. And then there's the aspect, it's dangerous, and basically, for example, with kids, I remember when I was growing up, we were all out in the bush doing things, but I don't see kids do that anymore. They're on their computers, computer games, playing games with people down the street, and they're still in their own homes. And this is not when it's a rainy day. This is when it's sunny. So, and where my when I go and visit home, they've got beautiful Nambucca State Forest, and there's bush, and I've got shelters built all through there, and it's great. Great. Where I grew up, there was all this stuff. But I wonder when I'm home on holidays. And I don't see any kids walking through there at all. I'm thinking, wow, this is like a paradise. And it makes me ask a question. You just don't see kids having that interest to get out there and do some of these things. So we're talking about as their important skills, but it's getting the kids interested in wanting to learn those skills.
Yeah, it's true. But then there's plenty, if we're talking about the school context, there's plenty of stuff that kids are not interested in initially at school, that they're introduced to at school. So I don't think that's necessarily a reason not to try to do it, but I think it needs to be done in a context where, not that they have to do it, but where their attention is away from, we all like doing what we like doing in our leisure time, and I don't think you necessarily want to kind of deny kids from, there's advantages to learning how to operate with technology. We were talking earlier, we had a coffee before we recorded this, it was still raining earlier on, and one of the things that we were talking about was when just before I set Frontier Bushcraft up, I set my blog up 10 years ago. I had no idea how to set a website up. I had no idea how to register a domain name, and there are lots of other things that I've had to learn along the way in terms of developing the ability to share information online over the internet that I had to go and learn for myself. And so I think if you're frightened of technology, that doesn't necessarily do a kid any good, because the world that we live in, the world that they have to operate in as an individual and as a worker, is largely involved in is some sort of technology is integrated with that, whether it's in the office, whether it's in a vehicle, whatever it is. So I don't think we should necessarily try and wrestle kids away from computers entirely, because actually they need to know how to use them, and they need to be familiar with
balance between.
There's a balance, and but in terms of, there's a lot of, so my point is, there's a lot of stuff that's taught at school that isn't very useful to most people, and there's a lot of stuff that we could teach to people at school that's useful to most people.
And not just to have to say you can go and join the Scout, but even without saying the wrong thing, with the Scouting movement, I've known some talks I've done in different places, just the kids' knowledge of different knots is not what I remember it used to be when I was in Cubs, and that's changing as well. And some of the activities that different scouting groups are doing are more geared at keeping the kids entertained rather than educating, to keep them enthused rather than watering down the subject to keep the kids interested.
Well, there's a couple of things that have gone on there, I think, and I'm not fully familiar with how things are with Scouts in Australia, or even really very much familiar at all, other than what people tell me. But I know certainly back in the UK, back before I was in the Cubs and the Scouts, it was very much kind of, scouting for boys, knots, building rope bridges, the kind of the proper original kind of scouting stuff. And then it kind of became very much dependent on who your scout leader was, how much of that you did, because it's all dependent upon volunteers. So some scout groups would be really good, they'd be doing all sorts of pioneering crazy stuff,
like a good martial arts teacher teaching good realistic skills.
And so it's dependent upon the teacher, and other scout groups, all you'd be doing is playing British Bulldogs and not very much, you wouldn't be doing very much because the scout leaders didn't have the ability to teach you very much. And so going in parallel, looking at the issue about schools, it's all well and good as saying, well, let's teach kids this, that, and the other in schools, but you need people to be able to teach them that, and you need capable people who understand the principles and understand the nuances to be able to share that with the kids. And so it's not something that's ever going to happen overnight. I think you've got an education of the teachers that needs to go on first, before you even introduce any of those things, which is why it's easier for some of these things to be introduced in out of school activities, because they can be bolted onto the school curriculum or bolted onto what the kid does. It's an after school club, or because then you can get other people to come in and teach it. It's the whole thing that's happened with forest schools in the UK, which is a concept that came over from Scandinavia. That's taken well over a decade to become properly established.
Bush schools now, which is now starting to eventuate, which is fantastic. A lot of Steiner schools here have a big emphasis on not necessarily bushcraft, but bush type skills, and they're not just the practical skills that you get that might help you in a situation. They actually help you gain a deeper respect for the environment, and that's what I think. There's a lot of things in bushcraft that people probably don't realise is sort of the secondary skills you learn, or the respect, like learning how to look after all these skills. Like in learning these traditional skills, you learn about Aboriginal culture, and it gives you a deeper respect for what's gone on before, and how the land was managed. And I think how our own Indigenous Australians for 60,000 years not just survived and eked out a living, but lived comfortably through a deeper knowledge of the environment that we can sort of gain, and that gives us an insight into their culture, and it helps us respect it. And I personally believe every Australian should cherish our Indigenous culture, because it is amazing, but we tend to look at it with a completely different set of eyes, and it's only through exploring those skills and actually physically doing them that you sort of that's opened up.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and I think we can take a step back, and a very, very simple thing that, it's an example I've given a number of times before, but it's still valid, is that I can take a group of people on a one-day course, or on a day within a longer course, and we can go for a walk through the woods, and we can say, okay, let's have a look at these trees, how to identify them, talk about what we can use them for. Let's have a look at some of these plants. This is self-heal, this is ground ivy, this is broadleaf plantain, this is a food, this is a medicine, and all of a sudden people start looking where they're putting their feet and being careful not to trample on things that you've just told them the value of, whereas before it was just green stuff. And look, what did we do when we came here? We came to find this spot to record this, and we came off a trail over there, and we've walked across this grass to get here. And one of the things that happens to us as kids is that we're taught that it's absolutely fine to walk on green stuff. We can, apart from, unless there's a sign that says keep off the grass, it's like whether it's the playing field, the sports field at school, whether it's in the park, we can run around but it's not just grass that's here. I mean, there's dandelions here, there's clover, there was plantain there, that looks almost like a violet there, it might not be. Yeah, there's all sorts of useful and interesting plants in here. And yet we're taught that we can walk all over them, and that there's no value to them. And I think one of the things that, I'm not saying that people should walk around being completely frightened of where to put their feet, but as soon as you start learning the value of those things, or just not even the use of them, people view them differently, and they see it as a valuable resource that's not necessarily something that they want to step on or just waste unnecessarily. And that's just a very, very simple level of understanding before you start going into deeper levels of understanding and seeing how certain things are connected and whatnot. So yeah, it doesn't take very long for people to change their attitude towards the environment around them once they start learning about it and learning the usefulness of it. It's not just an aesthetic. I think if you go, oh, that's pretty to look at, that's a sort of subjective argument, which is why you end up with deforestation and stuff, because people think, oh well, you just want it there because it looks nice, or you want it there, you want it to be some sort of zoo or museum or something. But as soon as you actually start attaching some value to it, which is a kind of Western, I'm not saying monetary value, but it's still a Western way of looking at things. As soon as you start attaching a value to things, it's like that's useful, people want to protect it more. And I'm going to have a bit of a rant here, because I've been putting some YouTube videos up recently, and when I review some of my videos, this ad keeps coming up, and it's an ad for a drone, this little drone, and part of that ad, there's this drone flying, and it's got this flamethrower attached to it, and it's flamethrowing a perfectly healthy tree. Now, why on earth is that acceptable? It's just basically using vandalism of nature to advertise your product. It's saying, oh, this is a really robust drone. You know, it's like,
yeah, that's a bit.
It's like, why are you not flamethrowing some old lady's house as part of your ad? Because it's equally offensive to me.
No, that's a really valid point.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. But that's the society that we live in, where
because it's acceptable.
Because it's acceptable. It's just something that you can damage. It's just there to do with what you want, and actually it isn't. There's a lot more value to it than that once you start learning. So anyway, that kind of stuff gets me annoyed.
I understand. I haven't seen that actually. I don't see a lot of ads, but
I won't be buying your drone, by the way. If you're watching. That's
interesting, but I find that a lot of these skills, the lack, I know you've talked about it before, and it's like when we come down to having laws and rules that are put in place, and you can have rules that sort of prevent people interacting with an environment, so they don't end up valuing it, and something dangerous, we'll put a sign there preventing people from using it, so therefore kids can't interact and they won't value it, and then there's a whole skill base that can be lost from that, and then all of a sudden we just live in a society full of so many laws, and hang on, look at this pretty green thing, oh yeah, that was a we remember what it used to be like to pass through it, like same with fire, who knows what could happen after all this.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things, again, there's several things interlinked there. I mean, one of it is just like not allowing people to sort of interact and interface with the natural world in ways that we've been doing for tens of thousands of years, which I think is wrong. Of course, we don't want people setting bushfires and damaging property and things, but equally, that isn't a necessary follow-on from allowing people to access the bush and access forests and interact with them in a responsible way. You know, I've had hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of fires. I've never started a bushfire. You know, I've had campfires all over the world. I've never started a forest fire. I've never started a peat fire, a heather fire, a moor fire, you know, a bushfire. It doesn't necessarily follow that happens. In fact, unless you're highly, you know, irresponsible, it won't happen. So there's nothing to stop people from interacting with nature in those very kind of fundamental ways. But if you put laws in place, then of course the law stops them from doing it, and then people don't have the ability to do it, and then they don't have the skill is lost, or just the skill to do it carefully and safely is lost, and it's this, and then people don't value it if people can't access it. You know, it's the same. You know, there's a certain brand of conservation which doesn't see people as part of the environment. They want to, even indigenous people, they don't like indigenous people on the land because it somehow damages the natural environment, which I think is perverse, because we are part of the natural environment. And particularly they don't like modern people going and accessing wilderness areas, and of course you need to protect some very rare habitats from overuse, of course, but you know, in terms of, you know, very widespread types of habitat that are wild, there's nothing wrong with people going and interacting with that environment. People have been interacting with those environments since, you know, whenever, before anybody can remember, and unless you allow people to go and access those places and interact with them, then they're not going to value them, and then you're going to get a big corporation that comes in and wants to log it, wants to chop it down and pull oil out from underneath it, wants to put a pipeline through it, wants to do whatever with it. Unless you've got people who are fully invested in wanting to maintain that environment, they'll be lost. And so I think there's a deeper reason for allowing people to interact with natural environments, because otherwise they'll all eventually go.
Children today become the leaders of tomorrow.
So this kind of conservationism which stops people whether it's setting laws about fires, whether it's about stopping people from walking anywhere off a boardwalk, whether it's not allowing people to camp in particular places, all it does is it means eventually, in my opinion, those places will more likely be lost, because nobody's, other than the people that are setting the laws to say you can't go there, because you're just alienating everyone else. It's like, if I can't go there, I don't care. What value is it to me if I can't go and interact? And that's kind of a selfish perspective, but if you take that across society, it's like, if society can't interact with things that they're paying to be preserved, why the hell should they defend them when they're...
That's a good point.
You know, and it's why I think it's one of the fundamental reasons why we have this big problem with why conservation has a big problem at the moment of trying to get people engaged with doing the things they need to do to tackle, you know, climate change or plastic pollution or whatever, because they don't value those places, because they don't go there, they don't have any connection with it. And so I think the more we can build connection between individuals and the environment, the more likely you are to kind of engage them with looking after a little bit of it.
And particularly the politicians that make those decisions, some of the decisions that are made, without listing a few, I wonder what sort of upbringing some of those people had as children to lead them to make some of the decisions that they do. Like, just something that I have a rant about is particularly with the back burning, and having spent a lot of time now up in northern Australia with and outdoor guiding, and actually going and doing some back burning with some of the traditional owners and elders up there, and how that's been done for 60,000 years, and how the land was completely managed, as it was all over Australia. And there's some great accounts and many great books to read about that, which is now surfacing now about Australia. It was like a parkland, and it was managed with fires continually, with no understory. But of course, with the destruction of the Aboriginal culture of the East Coast, that management, 60,000 years of land management, and which most Australian vegetation needs fire for germination, where fire is lit at a particular time and in a particular way in certain areas. And with the destruction of that culture, that management ceased. So now when we have these fires, which are either deliberately lit or through carelessness, it's just 10 times worse than what it would normally be.
And even the natural fires get more out of hand than they would have done otherwise.
And I find that's something that really frustrates me, because the evidence is still there, and it's still being carried out. Yes, the gumleys, there's a higher cineol content in the leaves down here than what it is up north, and there's a greater population down here. But that practice and what it was, and there's like plenty of evidence, and there's some fantastic documents and books that have been written about that, with all the evidence put there about what it was like in 1788 before Europeans came here. And that sort of information, I feel, is being lost, and we tend to, and that's, I think, one of the major contributing factors. Now, that's not taking anything about from the lots of people that lost their homes, and having lost our house to fire when I was young, I know exactly what that's like. So it's but if it's a combination of a few things that it could halve these number of fires, and I think a lot of it is just our stupidity in not either looking at teaching people how to use fire and how to make it properly, as well as not carrying out practices that have been going on for thousands of years, and also just people that light fires deliberately. Wait for the plane to go over.
That float plane again.
And also people lighting fires deliberately, which then that's a people, and why. So that's probably a societal problem as to why people are doing those sorts of things, which could be with any sort of subject.
I think that might be quite a good way to kind of come full circle with the whole conversation, because there's lots of different strands there. I mean, one, there's people doing stupid stuff. That's education. Just people do stupid stuff because they don't know better. Most people, not everyone, Most people don't do things that turn out to be bad because they want to be bad. It's just stupidity. There's a separation of people from the land, both in terms of indigenous populations, and that's going on all over the world, partly because of some horrendous government policies in the past, and I'm not just talking about Australia. It happened in Canada, it's happened all over the world, and it still happens now in places where people are trying to, people are settled, people are separated from the land, they lose their indigenous way of life, not taking any notice of indigenous knowledge. That's another thing that happens. And also just more generally, people, and I don't just mean indigenous people, because everyone's moved around all over the world for several centuries now, just people being separated from the environment as well. Going back to what we said before, they don't understand it, they don't value it, and then you've got some scientists who are studying it from a modern perspective, who are saying some very sensible things, in terms of what happened in the past, what we could do about it now. And politicians generally don't listen to those people. They tend to listen to what will get them voted in the next election.
Of course.
And so we've got this sort of short-termist kind of, and this is just a general point about the way Western democracy seems to work these days. You've got the very short-termist view that's driving all the decision making all the time, whether it's climate change, whether it's pollution, whether it's resource management, education, everything's just short term. And when you manage everything for the short term all the time, then you end up with these problems coming up over the long term. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing.
That's definitely all around the world. Well, we've
got a bit political there.
It is. We've got a bit deep, but it's all valid.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we've run out a bit of time. This is, I shouldn't say go. I could actually sit and talk all day actually. But there's still many things I could have discussed.
Yes.
Paul actually is a brilliant martial artist, jiu-jitsu. We both have a shared love for the martial arts, but maybe that's on another topic, a time we can talk about that, and because there are links with that as well. But I've thoroughly enjoyed our little discussion here, and I hope you have as well. And we'll most certainly in the future, we're looking at maybe some collaborations coming up where Paul, or either we can do some sort of collaborative effort together of doing some courses out here in Australia, either Frontier or Bushcraft Survival Australia combined with you, and it's
a nice collaboration would be good, Gordo. So,
it'd be, and I really look forward to that, and just sort of getting people. I think the scene is starting to grow here actually, and I think that's a great thing. It's worldwide, but it's. But I'd like to say thank you so much for coming out here on this lovely summer day in the park and having a chat with me. I really,
my pleasure,
really appreciate it.
Anytime. Yeah.
Okay.
Been a pleasure to be here and talk to your audience as well.
Thank you.
Hopefully,
some
of what I said made sense. So.
Oh, it's great. And any links and any points that we've brought up, I'll be sure to put those in the notes under this episode. So until next time, we'll see you again very soon.
Yep.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Paul.
Take care. Thanks.